Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, I've been looking at the effects of underground mining on the hydrology and community resilience of coastal upland swamps on the Woronora Plateau for a number of years. In a nutshell, along with my research collaborators, I found very strong evidence that longwall mining is responsible for cumulative intergenerational loss of high-value public ecosystem services provided by upland swamps. These coastal upland swamps occur under specific hydrological, topographic and geological conditions. They occupy headwaters of streams and valley infill environments, and you can see in the aerial image up the top that the dry eucalyptus woodland matrix surrounds the upland swamps. Banksia thicket is on the upper and drier valley sides. Restioid heath and sedgeland occur on the wetter valley sides, and cyperoid heath and tea tree thicket occupy the wettest valley sides and the floors in the landscape. These upland swamp communities are groundwater dependent ecosystems, and they rely on shallow aquifer groundwater in the sandstone bedrock to maintain high soil moisture in the root zone. This hydrological connection has been demonstrated by a number of researchers. Keith and Myesko, that in 1993, there's a schematic here at the bottom from their work, their research looking at the hydrological gradient. And there's also more recent research that I led in Darrawal National Park showing the inherent hydrological gradient in these swamps. So hydrology is the primary driver for swamp formation. Upland swamps provide valuable ecosystem services for human populations. They provide regulating services, including water purification, flow rate regulation, flood mitigation, and carbon sequestration. Provisioning services include genetic resources and water supply. Wetlands provide supporting services to primary production, nutrient recycling, and global water and carbon cycles. And I must also note that they are just beautiful landscapes. I took this photo on Madden's Plains in Darrawal National Park, and it was just after a fire. And you can see the Xanthoria resinosus were flowering en masse, and the invertebrate activity in the landscape was incredible. Coastal upland swamps, as we know, are listed as endangered under state and Commonwealth legislation, and a number of threatening processes affect them. Perhaps the least tractable and most pressing of these threats is alteration of hydrology following subsidence due to longwall mining. And I won't go into a description of the disturbance, as you're well versed in the process. Suffice to say that when mining disturbance occurs, it causes collapse, fracture and disturbance zones. The subsidence can be expressed at the surface, and here you can see a fracturing of a sandstone outcrop at the surface. The disturbance can profoundly alter the hydrological parameters of a swamp system, and that's what I'll be reporting on in most part today. Multiple tiers of governance, as we know, are in place to redress ongoing declines in swamp extent and condition. And this is directly via conservation management and indirectly by influencing land use decisions through legislative and policy frameworks. And I know Lauren spoke about ecologically sustainable development, but I do think that it requires reiterating. We know that it is, in essence, there to provide for the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The mitigation hierarchy helps deliver ESD. It requires developers to first avoid impacts and then sequentially minimise, restore, and finally offset or compensate any unavoidable impacts. In New South Wales, of course, ecologically sustainable development and the mitigation hierarchy are well embedded in legislation, and they're used as standard terminology in over 60 statutes. Numerous government and industry reports have indicated that longwall mining is affecting swamp hydrology, but the evidence has been largely confined to the grey literature, and predominantly it's been anecdotal and qualitative. So we wanted to get a quantitative understanding of what the mining disturbance means for swamp hydrology. We looked at soil moisture retention in the Vadose zone, and this is a soil zone between the surface and the groundwater zone. We compared soil moisture in unmined and mined swamps. We were interested in how water storage and regulation functions of upland swamps may be affected by longwall mining. Our study sites were located in 8 upland swamps on the Warrenora Plateau. 3 sites were located above longwalls mined in the catchment area by the Dendrobium mine, and this was specifically in Area 3B. And these are the black squares on the map. 1 site was above the mine footprint, but it was not undermined at the time of data collection, and 4 further sites were located to the north and south of the mine in Darawal National Park and on catchment land, and these are shown as the black triangles on the map. The sites were representative of the hydrological gradient from drier Banksia thicket to wet tea tree and cyporoid heath communities. At each site, we established automatic hydrological monitoring stations, each with 3 dielectric soil moisture probes connected to a data logger to measure moisture in the soil profile. The probes contained 4 sensors at 10, 20, 30 and 40 centimetres depth. Daily rainfall was measured using tipping bucket rain gauges, and we controlled for a number of environmental covariables to try to address the fact that the mined sites were necessarily clustered. We calculated soil moisture persistence as the number of days after each rainfall event until soil moisture dropped below 50%. We used accelerated failure time models for the analysis. This figure shows persistence curves. They're the unbroken lines, plus or minus 1 standard error, and they're the dotted lines for the 50% soil moisture threshold. The mined swamps are shown in mustard and the unmined swamps are shown in blue. The data were collected from 2012 to 2017 and are separated into swamp subcommunities. By testing for differences between A, vegetation types, B, unmined and mined sites, and C, an interaction of the 2 factors, we were able to show a number of results. Firstly, we found very strong evidence for differences in soil moisture persistence between unmined and mined upland swamps after controlling for vegetation type and other environmental variables. And this is clearly shown in the figure. It's most evident for tea tree thicket and cyporoid heath. You can see those persistence curves recede much more rapidly in the mined swamps. We were also able to show that mined upland swamps dried more quickly than unmined soils, and that the mining effect was more evident for wetter than for drier vegetation types. But I should note that it was evident across all of the vegetation subcommunity, all of the subcommunities of swamps. The modelling also tells us there is strong evidence of hydrological differentiation. That is a hydrological gradient across vegetation communities in unmined swamps, but there was no evidence of hydrological differentiation in mined swamps. So the interpretation here is that it appears that the hydrological gradient is destroyed by mining. We also found that soil moisture continued to decline with time since mining. So we are not seeing a stabilisation or a resumption of soil moisture levels. The swamps are continuing to dry. And I just want to show, to demonstrate to you the sponge capacity of these swamp soils. I don't know if it's going to show, no it hasn't. But basically I had a video of just to show how spongy these soils are. There we go. This is me lightly pressing a swamp turf that's been used in a related glasshouse experiment. And it's this water regulation and retention function that we stand to lose permanently if longwall mining proceeds. For a subset of swamps, we were also able to obtain piezometer data contemporaneously. So here I have a qualitative comparison of rainfall, soil moisture and groundwater level signatures in both unmined and mined swamps. On the x-axis, we have time. That's on the horizontal axis. And then on the y-axis, we have hydrological signatures in the groundwater, badose, and surface zones. And you can see that while the rainfall pattern is similar across both of the swamp types, the soil moisture and groundwater level responses are very different. In the unmined swamp, we see persistence of soil moisture and groundwater levels for prolonged periods. In the mined swamp, we see a transition to rainfall responsiveness with spikes in moisture when rain falls, but a rapid return to low soil moisture. So now to tie in the policy implications of our research. We have provided quantitative evidence of persistent hydrological impacts of longwall mining. We know that these impacts are largely irreversible because all documented industry attempts at restoration have failed to re-establish pre-mining hydrological function, and this was demonstrated in a Commonwealth review in 2014. We also know that upland swamps are geographically restricted in Australia, and this is reflected in their endangered status, both at the state and federal level. I would argue that decision makers need to identify upland swamps as sites where targets are highly irreplaceable. They are not widely distributed and therefore cannot be offset or substituted. Our mitigation hierarchy policy framework therefore dictates that upland swamps should be avoided when longwall mines are approved. Avoidance is the only approach to prevent further hydrological and biodiversity impacts. In the context of the current proposal, there are options for avoidance. I note that the applicant indicates that avoidance of longwalls directly below upland swamps is technically feasible. Another potential option may be to undertake partial extraction of seams below upland swamps, but I must emphasise that this would require examination of hydrological responses if this came to pass. In my research, I'm now turning my attention to the trajectories of swamp communities after mining. In this cup and ball analogy of a state and transition model or regime shift, the different states are defined according to different disturbance thresholds. I'm using glasshouse and natural experiments to follow the trajectory of swamp communities after longwall mining and fire disturbance. I expect that upland swamps are set on an irreversible course with longwall mining causing dewatering and fire removing above ground biomass, ultimately causing the transition to novel non-swamp communities. I think it's pertinent to return to a point I made earlier about cumulative landscape scale impacts of the proposal. What is before the Commission involves extension of an already extant mine footprint. So swamp level hydrological disturbance is actually replicated across the landscape with each of the mining areas butting up against each other. With time, the swamp woodland mosaic is lost across the entire mine footprint. It's unclear where the functional tipping point lies, but in my opinion, this cumulative disruption of an endangered ecological community is ill-conceived and reckless. So just in conclusion, our field results have indicated that underground mining cannot be out of sight, out of mind. Regulators need to ensure upland swamps are avoided at the planning stage to safeguard hydrological integrity and ecosystem function of upland swamps and the wider landscape mosaic. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Tanya. Just have a question from your research. Clearly you have a good understanding of the current role and function that these upland swamps play. Have you turned your mind at all to some of the climate change scenarios and the potential role they could play in future? Does it change at all? Does it diminish? Does it become more important?
Climate change is one of the threats affecting coastal upland swamps. It's a listed threat as well. So it's certainly part of the problem for coastal upland swamps, and saliently, obviously, extraction of coal and use of it as a non-renewable resource, and it's going to add to the carbon, problem, and therefore climate change, it will exacerbate it, is So it's sort of a two-pronged attack, so to speak, on the upland swamps in that sense. But certainly in and of itself, as it stands now, climate change is a threat to upland swamps.
And just a second question, we had a speaker talk to us about the potential for upland swamps, if they're undermined and obviously disturbed, rather than being carbon sinks, they might then release carbon to the atmosphere. Would you like to comment on that at all?
Yes, it's not my area of expertise. However, I have done a lot of reading around that as part of the upland swamps, and I agree with that. I understand that a lot of these swamp systems, it's more complicated, and I'm talking more the global literature. It's not necessarily a straight transaction, but I think overall, and certainly Kirsten Cowley's recent publication in Science of the Total Environment indicates that it is a net carbon store at the moment, and that's certainly one of the ecosystem services that upland swamps provide, disproportionate sort of capture of carbon. So if the swamps lose their hydrological regime, then they cease being swamps. And this is not, I know earlier you were talking about impact diminishing, and I understand that was with regard to water entirely. But my understanding is that the impacts to swamps are irreversible, and there'll be no return to swamp communities once they've been undermined and dewatered.
Thank you. John, do you have questions? No? Richard?
Just one. I'm sorry to ask a fairly obvious question, Doctor, but right at the very end with your slide about the transition or decline of a swamp to what you've called a non-swamp community as a result of the impacts of longwall mining. I take it a non-swamp community is a form of ecosystem, is it, that where there's insufficient water for it to be considered a wetland or a swamp?
That's correct, yes. So there's the idea that they will go to a drier community. It's unclear exactly what that would be, but potentially just the surrounding woodland mosaic.
A terrestrial system instead of an aquatic one, correct? And correct. I guess it's obvious, but you're the expert, not me, that impact is fatal to any member of the wetland ecosystem that's dependent on it being a wetland.
Correct, because they are so dependent on that hydrological regime, the extant hydrological regime that they've evolved for. They have various tissue or enchyma in their in the plant itself to deal with that anaerobic environment that they are adapted to. So as soon as that is removed, then they can no longer exist. So your threatened species like Pultonea aristata, all of the frogs and giant dragonfly and so on.
All right. Thank you.